Bobby DeBarge was the voice that could stop you in your tracks. High, haunting, and unforgettable. As the lead singer of the Motown group Switch and a member of the legendary DeBarge family, he was often called the most talented of them all. His falsetto defined an era, influencing countless singers who came after him. But behind the gift was a man in turmoil. While the spotlight shined brightly on his talent, Bobby's personal life was filled with shadows. Addiction, prison time, heartbreak, and secrets that ultimately consumed him. In his later years, far away from the glamour of Hollywood, Bobby made his home in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he tried to find peace while still carrying the scars of fame. He was a father, leaving behind children who loved him, even as they witnessed his struggles. And though he once stood at the center of Motown's success, his financial legacy tells a very different story about the cost of fame when demons go unchecked. In the end, Bobby DeBarge's life was cut tragically short. His death shocked fans, leaving questions that linger decades later. Tonight, we're going inside Bobby DeBarge's world, his Grand Rapids home, his children, his net worth, and the tragic circumstances that ended his life far too soon. Inside Bobby DeBarge's Grand Rapids home and personal life. When fans think of Bobby DeBarge, they often remember him on stage, a spotlight shining down, his falsetto soaring above the music, and an audience caught in the spell of his voice. But the Bobby DeBarge who lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan during his later years was a very different man. Away from the stages of Motown and the bright lights of touring, his home life in Grand Rapids reflected both refuge and regret. It was the place where he tried to rebuild himself, where he faced the consequences of his choices, and where he wrestled with the demons that had followed him since childhood. Bobby came from one of the most famous musical families in America. The DeBarge siblings, Elle, Bunny, Mark, Randy, and James, all carried the gift of music. But Bobby was different. He was older. He was the leader of his own group Switch before the family's rise, and his falsetto was widely considered the most powerful of them all. Yet behind the music, Bobby carried scars that no stage could heal. Abuse in his childhood, pressures of fame, and an early exposure to drugs set him on a path that would eventually cost him nearly everything. By the mid-1980s, when the DeBarge family's fame began to unravel under the weight of addiction and poor management, Bobby found himself retreating more and more into privacy. His home in Grand Rapids wasn't just a house, it was his attempt to escape. Fans who imagine mansions and luxury estates for Motown stars would be surprised to know that Bobby's life was far from glamorous in those later years. His Grand Rapids residence was modest, a reflection of a man who once had it all, but was now living with far less. Inside his home, Bobby surrounded himself with reminders of both his triumphs and his regrets. Old records and awards were there, but so were signs of the battles he had endured. His home was quiet compared to the chaos of his past. Neighbors recalled him as someone who mostly kept to himself, a man who didn't flaunt his fame, but carried an aura that hinted at a bigger life once lived. He wasn't the superstar in the neighborhood. He was simply Bobby, trying to live out his days with some measure of normalcy. This attempt at normal life was complicated by his health and his history. Bobby's struggles with heroin and cocaine were well documented, and his years of substance abuse had taken a devastating toll on his body. Prison time for drug trafficking in the late 1980s further hardened him, but it also left him more determined to find stability when he came out. Grand Rapids was that place of stability, not a glamorous stage, but a city where he could be more anonymous, where he could focus on family rather than fame. Family was central to Bobby's personal life, even as he struggled to maintain the relationships that mattered most. He was married to Terry, and together they had children who loved him dearly. Fatherhood was both a joy and a burden for Bobby. He wanted to be a good father, to provide love and stability that he himself never received as a child, but his own demons often stood in the way. Addiction, illness, and the weight of his past made it hard to live up to the expectations he had for himself. Yet, even through his struggles, Bobby's children knew he loved them. His home in Grand Rapids was filled not just with reminders of his career, but also with the presence of his family. Laughter, arguments, and the everyday moments that mattered more to him than the applause of strangers. Friends and relatives have said that Bobby was a complicated man in those years. On one hand, he was reflective, sometimes even gentle, looking back on his career with pride and sorrow. On the other hand, he could be distant, weighed down by regrets that never left him. His house became a kind of cocoon, a place where he could both hide from the world and face himself. For someone who had once lived so publicly, Grand Rapids gave him privacy, but it also forced him to sit with the reality of his choices. What makes Bobby's home life in Grand Rapids so poignant is the contrast it paints. This was a man who had once sung for thousands, who had worked with some of the greatest names in Motown, who had been called one of the most gifted falsetto singers of his generation. Yet here he was, living quietly, often in pain, surrounded not by wealth, but by the fragile comforts of family and memory. His home was not a palace, but it was his sanctuary. Imperfect, modest, and deeply personal. To understand Bobby DeBarge, you have to look beyond the fame. His life at home in Grand Rapids wasn't about gold records or screaming fans. It was about trying to hold together a life that had been fractured by addiction, loss, and regret. It was about being a father, a husband, and a man who longed for peace, even as his health declined. In the end, his home wasn't just where he lived. It was where he tried to heal, where he tried to love, and where he prepared for the final tragic chapter of his story. It was a place of contradictions, filled with echoes of glory, haunted by pain, but grounded in the reality of a man who, despite everything, still longed for a better ending. And that is the truth about Bobby DeBarge's Grand Rapids home. It was not a mansion of success, but a mirror of his life. A life once full of promise, later scarred by struggle, yet still marked by the simple hope of finding peace. Bobby DeBarge's children and family life. Behind the falsetto that captivated millions was a man who quietly carried one of the most difficult roles of all, being a father. Bobby DeBarge's career and personal struggles often dominate his story, but his children and family life reveal another side of him, a side defined by love, responsibility, and regret. For someone who grew up in a household marked by abuse and dysfunction, Bobby longed to create something better for his own children, even as his demons often got in the way. Bobby married Terry DeBarge, often known later as Terry DeBarge Spencer, in 1983. Their union came at a time when Bobby was still a rising star, the lead singer of Switch, and a man admired for his musical genius. To outsiders, they looked like a young couple with everything in front of them. But those who knew Bobby closely understood that his marriage would be tested by the same forces that haunted him for years: drug addiction, the pressures of fame, and the legacy of his troubled childhood. Despite the turbulence, Bobby and Terry shared love, and out of that love came children. They had 2 sons, Christian and Bobby III. For Bobby, becoming a father was both terrifying and transformative. He wanted desperately to be the kind of father he never had. His own childhood was marked by pain, a violent and abusive father, a fractured family dynamic, and the crushing expectations of being the eldest in a musically talented household. Those scars never healed, but they gave him a clear vision. He didn't want his children to grow up the way he had. In the early years, Bobby's children were the center of his world. He adored them, and family members recall how much he talked about wanting to give them stability. Even while battling his own inner turmoil, he tried to carve out a sense of normalcy for them in his Grand Rapids home. Photos and memories from those days show a father who, despite his struggles, lit up when he was around his kids. He found joy in the little things, watching them play, listening to their laughter, and imagining futures for them beyond the chaos that had consumed so much of his own life. But being Bobby DeBarge also meant battling demons that never stayed quiet for long. Addiction had already tightened its grip on him by the time he became a father, and it made consistency nearly impossible. There were times when Bobby's children saw him at his best, sober, attentive, and loving, and times when they witnessed the darker side of his illness. For a man who longed to break the cycle of dysfunction, those moments were heartbreaking. Bobby knew the damage drugs had done to his career, his marriage, and his body, and he feared that it might also damage the one thing he loved most: his children. Still, what stood out about Bobby was that he never stopped trying. Even when he stumbled, even when prison separated him from his family, he held on to the role of fatherhood as tightly as he could. Letters, visits, and phone calls became ways to stay connected during those difficult years. For Bobby, the thought of his children gave him a reason to keep fighting. His wife, Terry, played a critical role in holding the family together. While Bobby's life unraveled due to drugs and prison, Terry became the rock, raising their sons with determination. She made sure they knew who their father was, not just in terms of his struggles, but also his brilliance. After Bobby's death, she continued to protect his legacy, ensuring that their children understood the complexity of the man they called Dad. For Christian and Bobby III, growing up in the shadow of their father's fame was never easy. They had to reconcile the man the world saw, a gifted singer whose life was cut short by tragedy, with the father they remembered, whose presence was sometimes fleeting, but always filled with love. In many ways, their relationship with Bobby mirrored his own conflicted life. Moments of joy and tenderness mixed with moments of absence and pain. Family for Bobby wasn't just about his children. His siblings were a huge part of his world. The DeBarge family was famously talented, but also famously troubled. Addiction and dysfunction ran through the family like an unshakable thread, and Bobby often found himself both a victim of and a participant in that cycle. Still, he remained close to his brothers and sisters, supporting them musically and emotionally whenever he could. The bond of family was complicated, but it was unbreakable. What makes Bobby's family life so poignant is the contrast it paints. Here was a man who could sing like an angel, but lived with demons that stole so much from him. He wanted to be the father who broke the cycle, and in many ways, he was. His children knew his love, and they knew his heart. But he also couldn't fully escape the shadows of his past, and that reality shaped the kind of father he was. When Bobby passed in 1995 at just 39 years old, his children were still young. They had to grow up without their father, carrying his name, but not his presence. Yet his legacy lives on through them. They are reminders of the man Bobby wanted to be, a father who loved deeply, even if imperfectly. Bobby DeBarge's children and family life tell us something essential about him. He was not just a falsetto, not just a Motown story, not just a tragic headline. He was a husband and a father who longed for normalcy in a life that rarely offered it. His children were his greatest source of pride, and though addiction and tragedy cut his time short, the love he gave them remains part of his legacy. In the end, Bobby's family story is bittersweet. It is the story of a man who wanted to give what he never received, who stumbled often but kept trying, and whose children now carry both the pain of his absence and the pride of his name. For all the headlines about his music and his death, this may be the most important truth. Bobby DeBarge loved his family, and that love outlived him. Bobby DeBarge's net worth and tragic death. When Bobby DeBarge's life came to a close in 1995, he was only 39 years old. To many fans, the news felt impossible. How could one of Motown's brightest voices, a man whose falsetto defined an era, be gone so young? But behind the brilliance of his music was a story filled with struggle, sacrifice, and tragedy. To fully understand his death, you have to look not just at the illness that took him, but also at the way his career and lifestyle shaped the final years of his life. The decline of a star. At the height of his career with Switch in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bobby DeBarge seemed unstoppable. Songs like There'll Never Be showcased his unmatched vocal range, and his presence gave the group a unique identity within Motown. Yet even then, Bobby was battling addiction. Drugs had been introduced into his life at a young age, and as fame grew, so did the access. By the time Switch was enjoying its biggest hits, Bobby was already caught in the cycle of dependency that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Addiction cost him opportunities. It strained his relationships with his siblings. It derailed musical projects, and it led to decisions that would prove devastating. In the late 1980s, Bobby was arrested and convicted for drug trafficking. He spent several years in federal prison, a period that took him off the stage and further distanced him from his career. Prison changed him, but it did not free him from the demons that plagued him: health and HIV. While serving time, Bobby's health took a turn that would ultimately prove fatal. He contracted HIV, a diagnosis that in the late 1980s carried enormous stigma and little hope for survival. Treatments were limited, and the disease progressed rapidly in many patients. For Bobby, who already had a weakened body from years of substance abuse, the illness was especially cruel. When he was released from prison in the early 1990s, Bobby returned to Grand Rapids, Michigan, trying to pick up the pieces of his life. He reunited with his wife, Terry, and his children, and he attempted to rebuild his career. He collaborated with his brothers in the family group DeBarge and worked on new music. But privately, he was sick. HIV began to attack his immune system, and complications from the disease grew worse with time. The final days. By 1995, Bobby's health was failing rapidly. Friends and family later described him as frail but still fighting, still carrying the same passion for music, even as his body weakened. He had spent much of his final years reflecting on his past, his successes, his mistakes, and the things he wished he could change. Those close to him say that despite the pain, he was determined to make peace with his family and with himself. On August 16, 1995, Bobby DeBarge lost his battle. He died in Grand Rapids from complications related to AIDS, leaving behind his wife, 2 young sons, and a grieving musical family. He was buried at Garfield Park Cemetery in Michigan. His death was not just the end of a life, but the silencing of a voice that had once been considered one of Motown's greatest gifts. The emotional aftermath. Bobby's death hit the DeBarge family hard. His siblings, already struggling with their own personal battles, were devastated by the loss of their brother and musical mentor. For fans, his passing was a reminder of the dangers of fame and the heavy toll of addiction. The public mourned not just the man, but the potential. The songs he never got to sing, the albums he never got to make, the future that was stolen too soon. For his wife and children, the grief was even deeper. His sons grew up without their father, left only with memories and stories of the man who loved them but could not stay. Terry carried the weight of protecting his legacy, making sure the world remembered not just his struggles, but also his brilliance. Bobby DeBarge's net worth. At the time of his death, Bobby DeBarge's financial legacy was modest. His net worth has been estimated at under $1 million, a stark contrast to the massive success he enjoyed during the peak of his career. This wasn't because his talent wasn't valuable, it was. But years of addiction, poor financial management, and legal troubles drained much of what he earned. The music industry in the 1970s and 1980s was also notorious for unfair contracts, and artists often made far less than fans assumed. Residuals from his work with Switch and with the DeBarge family group provided some income, but not enough to make him wealthy. Most of Bobby's later life was spent in modest circumstances. His home in Grand Rapids reflected this. Simple, comfortable, but far from extravagant. Unlike some stars who build empires, Bobby's financial picture showed the harsh reality of what happens when fame collides with addiction. Still, Bobby's true wealth wasn't measured in dollars. His influence on music continues to this day. Artists who followed, from R&B singers to pop stars, often cited his falsetto as an inspiration. His recordings remain timeless, and his voice lives on long after his passing. In many ways, his net worth in culture, in artistry, and in influence far exceeds the modest financial legacy he left behind. The tragedy of Bobby DeBarge's death is not just that he died young, but that his demons prevented him from reaching the full potential his talent promised. He could have been one of Motown's greatest stars, a legend alongside Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, or Smokey Robinson. Instead, his name is remembered with a mix of awe and sadness. Awe for the gift he gave, and sadness for the life cut short. Yet his story also serves as a warning and a lesson. It reminds us of the pressures young artists face, of the dangers of addiction, and of the importance of health and stability in an industry that often devours its brightest talents. Bobby's death was tragic, but his life was not meaningless. His music still moves people, his voice still echoes, his story still matters. Bobby DeBarge's net worth may have been small, but his legacy is immeasurable. His death may have been tragic, but his influence is eternal. He was a man of contradictions, brilliant yet troubled, famous yet forgotten, loved yet lost. And though he is gone, the falsetto that defined him still lingers in every song he recorded. For fans, his story is heartbreaking. For his family, it is deeply personal. And for music, it is a reminder of how fragile genius can be. Bobby DeBarge left this world too soon, but the memory of his voice ensures that he will never truly be silenced. Bobby DeBarge's life was a symphony of brilliance and heartbreak. His voice was unlike any other, soaring in falsetto, capturing emotions that words alone could never express. Yet behind that angelic sound was a man wrestling with demons that even fame and success could not silence. From the stages of Motown to a modest home in Grand Rapids, Bobby's journey was never about luxury or wealth. It was about struggle, love, and survival. He was a father who loved his children, a husband who longed for stability, and a brother whose influence shaped an entire generation of DeBarge music. His net worth may have been small, but the value of his artistry remains priceless. In the end, his tragic death at only 39 years old reminds us of the fragility of life and the cost of fame when it collides with pain. But his legacy still echoes in every song he touched and in the countless artists he inspired. So we leave you with a question. Was Bobby DeBarge's story a cautionary tale of talent undone, or the enduring legacy of a man who gave music something no one else could? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories behind the music.